And what could I possibly tell you about Richard Smith that you don't already know? I think everybody who is from Smithtown, has lived in Smithtown, we're not exactly starting at the bottom of the chain of knowledge here. I think we all come to this with a fair amount of knowledge as well as a fair amount of understanding both of what we think since happened with the founding of Smithtown and also the famous story of the Bull. And I'm going to talk about both and try to connect the two in a couple of ways too. Smithtown is far from the only place in America or on the planet that has its own interesting creation myth. And yet Smithtown's is colorful, it's wonderfly enduring, and it, as we all know, has sort of picked up a few wrinkles over the years as well. There are charming urban legends abound, as we know, from many other places, but this one happens to have its own particular charm to it that I think has carried it to this point. In 1880, Ferdinand T. Smith of Northport wrote the following lines for a poem about how his ancestor came to acquire the land of Smithtown. And this is just paraphrased, it's not the entire poem. On this isle of pines and sand, he had a special longing to possess himself of land. He bargained with the Indians when the moon was at its full, that he should have as much good land as he'd ride round on a bull. Ferdinand Smith, and we don't know very much about him, certainly seems to have been steeped in the story of his ancestor, and hearing some variation of this, put his own stamp on it, his own interpretation. And that's the good thing about a good story, is that it takes on many new varieties depending on the teller and depending on the person who puts it forward. The story of the Bull is something that we can't forget. We can't forget it because we drive past it on a daily basis, maybe several times. We can't forget it because it's in town mascots, mottos, all kinds of civic organizations that have it worked into their emblems. So we're constantly reminded of it. There are the good uses. There are the uses by the school in their sports team mascots. And then there's the profane, the ones that would certainly make Richard Smith blush or roll over in his grave. There is, for example, the Ugly Bull Saloon at 281A West Main Street, which on their website invites all of Long Island to, quote, come and chug a beer, dance like an idiot, and party like a rock star. What's really amazing is that there continues to be a lot of stock placed in this story at sort of a face value. And sometimes the authors get carried away and even reinvent and add on to things. I found an internet site titled, quote, "You mess with a bull, you get the horns," which says that a man named James Smith, that's the first I've heard that, a colonial settler, came to Long Island in the 1600s and made a deal with the Indians that were settled here. The Indians laughed at first, this website says, at his bet because no one could ride a bull for that long, but Smith's bull was special, and he raised it and tamed it, and from sunrise to sunset, he rode the bull and won the bet. So there's his version. A great story, any way you cut it, it changes depending on the teller. Of course, we all in this room are smarter than that. We all know that this is hogwash. And if we want to know the real Richard Smith, and we want to get back to that, we have to do a little bit of digging. Unfortunately, for us, the digging does answer some questions, but there's a lot that we don't know and we may never know. And in the absence of definitive knowledge, myth creeps in. Who was Richard Smith? Right, and you note the spelling, Richard Smythe. This is the way he spelled it historically in documents for much of his life. Not always. He did occasionally sign it S-M-I-T-H, the way we spell it today. Neither of these two gentlemen, by the way, is Richard Smith. We don't know what he looked like. These are two Puritans from the Massachusetts Bay Colony, 1640s. You may know the one on the right, John Winthrop, governor of the colony. Much of the current history that we have on Richard Smith comes down to us from a couple of different key sources. A lot of great work was done by the master genealogist of the Smith family, Dr. Frederick Kinsman Smith. And that volume of genealogy is while it's not perfect and it's not completely 100% unadulterated accuracy, it is still a great piece of work with a lot of primary document evidence at its source. His book, The Family of Richard Smith, 10 Generations, was put together after many years of research and travel and meticulously tracking down deeds, letters, burial plots, various scraps of ephemera to put together more than 300 years of information. When he died in World War II, the publication was then taken on and worked on for a number of other years by Mary Edna Smith and the Smithtown town historian Virginia Malone. This work was essential for the sketchy outlines of Richard Smith's life. However, over the years since 1967, since that publication, more information has churned up in other documents through the work of other historians. And it's my effort with this lecture to try to assimilate that and try to bring that together into one narrative. Despite many long years of effort, what we know about Richard is quite limited, really, and I'll get into some of those things that we know. But to answer first the most important question, did he ride a bull? Well, we don't know that, but one of the prime modes of agricultural transportation in the 17th century, of course, was a conveyance by ox cart, simple ox wheel carts that were pulled by oxen. And Smith makes no mention of such a vehicle, but there is mention, of course, of livestock in various documents, and he does refer to pastures in his will. And there's an interesting 1666 document which indicates that the man at least had a special affinity for horses. And this document, which is at the Smithtown Library, mentions that Benjamin Price exchanged a horse with Mr. Richard Smith of Nessaquag, being a sorrel color bald face and white feet, flaxen mane and tail for a sorrel horse bald face that was formerly Sam. Sorrel, by the way, is a clue in today's New York Times crossword puzzle, which was kind of interesting. So where was he from and how did he get here? Well, we know he was from Yorkshire and from the area around York. That's at least the best evidence that suggests where he was from, in northeastern England. And he departed aboard the ship John of London from London on October 2nd, 1635 at the age of 22. The ship manifest has been found. There is a Richard Smith on this document. Is it our Richard Smith? The probability is pretty darn good that it is, but we don't know that for 100%. Where was this boat headed? The boat was actually headed and bound for St. Christopher's, or later would become known as St. Kitts, which was a colony that had both French and English influence in it by the 1620s, and by the time of the voyage was home to basically people who were planting sugar plantations and ranching cattle. The most prosperous newcomer, a man by the name of William Freeman, had 500 acres of land on the island's northwest side by the early 1630s. Did Richard Smith stay there? We don't know if he stayed there. There were 28 men, 6 women aboard John of London, and the voyage, the ship actually made other trips between the Massachusetts Bay Colony and London in the late 1630s. It is possible that this ship went towards Massachusetts. There's no document that gives 100% accurately placing Richard Smith in Massachusetts, but it is presumed that that's where he eventually did wind up in the late 1630s. Now, from Massachusetts, of course, in 1640, there were a number of pioneers who left seeking new religious freedom, and they had their own Plymouth Rock moment when they arrived at Conscience Point, Southampton, in 1640. That's the spot at North Sea Harbor and just off the Great Peconic Bay where that initial European settlement was founded on the east end of Long Island. Was Richard Smith with them? It's not known, but he does eventually come to light in the first confirmed document that we have his presence after that 1635 ship passage in Southampton in 1643. What was his life like in Southampton? It was prominent, it was successful, but it was also troubled. He was married to Sarah in around 1640. Their first child, Jonathan, was born in 1641. And the first time that he shows up in Southampton town records is October 26, 1643, in which one Thomas Hildreth is ordered to pay him for an unknown matter of, quote, controversy. Hildreth was ordered to pay Smith a predetermined value of English wheat. Thus, from the very first, we have evidence of a man who would frequently run into conflict and also have a number of legal encounters with other town members in Southampton, but both positive and negative from his standpoint. Smith became a leader of the town. He oversaw the harvest and cutting up of whales. He also served a year's term as constable. But in the early fall of 1656, Smith was banished from Southampton, and based upon several early primary accounts, it appears that he had gone back to England sometime about a year before this banishment, back and come back with a group of Quakers, and was known in the records, known in the Massachusetts court records as their proselyte. While this led to a brief imprisonment in Massachusetts, it also may have been one of the impetuses that actually led the Southampton town fathers, who, mind you, were very strict Puritans, may have been a reason for his banishment from the town of Southampton, which happens in the fall of 1656. From there, Smith leaves and heads towards Setauket with help from Richard Woodhull, also of Southampton. But by the time he left Southampton, he had a very big family. 9 of his 10 children had been born: Jonathan, Elizabeth, Richard, Job, Adam, Obadiah, Samuel, Daniel, and Deborah, that last child. So we get to the question of how did he manage to get the parcel of land that became Smithtown? Well, for this story, we have to go to dueling deeds. And this is where the story gets a little bit complicated. Because there are multiple land claims. There's the claim that Smith makes, but there's also the claim that's made by neighbors to the west in Huntington. In 1650, Nassauconsic, who was the sachem of the Nessequig people, gave land to a number of people from Huntington, and this land included basically the area which is now Northport, or portions of Northport, but also extended right up to the Nissaquag River, and included the area that would become, or a large portion of the area that would become Smithtown. The land was given in exchange. The Europeans, the Wood brothers and Daniel Whitehead and several others, gave the Indians 6 coats, 6 fathom of wampum, 6 hoes, 6 knives. I'm not sure why all these sixes, but they gave them a number of material products in order to get the land. However, they didn't do very much with the land that was acquired. Smith, on the other hand, had the benefit of the fact that Nassaconsec, who was the sachem who'd given this land to the Huntington townspeople, would then feel that he hadn't actually legally and in an English way given it to those people, that he was just sort of lending it out, so to speak, because he also agreed to giving the land to Wyandanch, who we see here on the left, the sachem of the Montaukett peoples, which is why Wyandanch felt that he had claim to this very piece of land and why he would eventually grant it to Lyon Gardner, who would in turn give it to Richard Smith. Now, the story of how Wyandanch, or why Wyandanch would give this land to Lyon Gardner is a little bit hazy. It goes back, at least according to Gardner's account, to the story being that he had given it basically because Gardner had played a role in helping Quashawam, who had been kidnapped in 1653 by the Ninigrik tribe of Rhode Island, that he had been able to secure her release, and that it was payback. It was a nice gift, basically, from Wyandanch to finally be able to give something back to Lyon Gardner later on in 1659. What's actually on this deed is interesting. Now, the actual deed, this is a several generation removed illustration, so it's not great, the portion of it that you can see, but it's at the Brooklyn Historical Society. And if you look at it, there is some question to its authenticity, or at least to who's writing the deed, because it's very, very self-serving for Lyon Gardner. Basically, it says, "Be it known unto all men, both English and Indian, that I, Wyandanch, sachem, and my wife and son, my only son and heir, will give this land that lieth between Huntington and Setauket." Why does he give it? He says, according to the document, quote, that Gardner has appeared to us not only as a friend, but as a father. See what I mean by the self-serving language. And that therefore this land would be a great gift. Now, Smith was present at the signing of this document, and it has also been presumed that Smith was possibly one of the players in helping to arrange for Quashawam's release. All of that is speculation. There's no good document that actually solidly proves that. Eventually, the land is granted from Gardner to Smith in 1663, but that begins a long, legal, drawn-out battle between the town of Huntington and Richard Smith, and eventually the town of Smithtown. This legal battle, basically over boundary, will be fought for decades. And unlike what's written in the historical record, which says that basically it was resolved in 1677 by the governor's proclamation, the patent that was given to Richard Smith, it was not in fact resolved. There would be continuing arbitration, continuing court legal battles on this for generations to come, into the 1700s in fact, involving Richard Smith's heirs. So it was not something that was just neatly wrapped up in a package. And this is a document from our collection at Smithtown Historical Society that actually has arbitrators ruling on this. Eventually, the land disputes and squabbles will go away, but it will take a long time. It'll go right into the 1730s and 1740s before you get final closure to this. Meanwhile, Richard Smith, and you can see how he signs his name here. You can see Smythe, and his wife, Sarah, because that's the other interesting thing, is that she shows up on a lot of these documents too. She had just as an important role, in some sense, of being very, very hard-pressing to try to state the land claims of the family. They will eventually make their land available to their heirs and pass it on to all of their surviving children. Obadiah, one of their sons, had drowned around 1680, but there's 7 surviving children, 6 sons and 1 daughter, and of course the largest share would end up going to their eldest son, Jonathan, by right of primogeniture. Richard Smith cleans this up and eventually dies in 1692. His will is already basically written by that time, long before, and he's given much of this land already to his children as early as 1688, as this document shows. The town of Brookhaven had its own legal issues on the east side, as well as the town of Huntington. Relatively close, and with some changes over the years and some expansion to the south as well. Their children, Richard and Sarah, including the owner of this house, or eventually this house is built in 1708 for one of their grandchildren, the Obadiah Smith house, a house that I, in fact, lived in for a couple joyous years of my life. The Smith family would in turn propagate and continue to own and be the largest landowners in the community, and the civic leaders as well, and would all have, their children would have large families, their grandchildren would have large families, and so on and so on and so forth, to the point that the Smith surname was so common that if there had been a phone book in the 1850s, the S section would be pretty fat indeed. And as a matter of fact, Judge Smith, in Judge John Lawrence Smith, in his history of Smithtown, writes that, quote, meeting a stranger on the street, it's quite safe to address him as Mr. Smith. If you just don't know, just call him Mr. Smith. Now, what kind of physical remnants do we have of the man? Well, we have the documents. In terms of artifacts, this certainly is the essential. It is the Massachusetts chair / table. There was actually a back to it, and this form exists in 4 other museum collections that I know of, and only one of which still has that back that could be churned into a slat and laid across as a table. This photograph was taken in 1898 at the presumed grave site of Richard Smith, which descendants found in the 1890s. And if you come to the exhibition, they not only found this site, they actually dug down into the ground and believed to have found his bones there in this pretty site underneath a tree overlooking the Nissaquag River. And in fact, they measured the skull that they found. And we have the actual piece of twine in the exhibition that they used to measure whomever's skull, Richard Smith or whoever, that they found at this site. The essential materials included a snuff box, as well as a musket, as well as a number of other items which were in the family for generations and were celebrated as part of the ancestral tie and the spirit of the man, of Richard Smith, the man who didn't give up, the man who continued to press his land claims for so long. Well, the question that we need to get back to, though, is how did this story of the bull originate? And that, my friends, is a little bit harder to come across. We know that it existed way, way back. We know that the first mentions that we can find of it in histories and in documents go back to the early 19th century. In 1839, Benjamin F. Thompson is writing about it in his History of Long Island. And we also know that it eventually became so ingrained that it was used everywhere. It was used in advertising, in this, appropriately enough, real estate advertisement in the 1920s in Suffolk County News, Sayville publication. Well, there are many different ways that it would eventually circulate and go into the local culture. This wonderful tripartite painted screen, which is on display over at the exhibit, was painted by Helen Leroy Smith. She was a talented local artist. We were loaned this by Malcolm Smith very generously. This was his mother's work, done sometime from the 1930s or 1940s. She was also an artist that did porcelain plates, did other canvas works. And if you look closely at it, it includes Richard Smith's coat of arms and the Latin verse at the bottom, nec timeo nec spurno, which means I neither fear nor despise. So again, where did the story come from? I'm kind of skating around that, but we'll get back to that. Richard Smith, his descendants continuously refer to him as Bull Smith. The earliest mention of him as being Bull Smith is found in several documents and letters in the early 19th century. And the suggestion, there's a number of different suggestions, one of which comes from Judge John Lawrence Smith's History of Smithtown, is that perhaps the story derived from mythology. I'm going to propose a number of different possible derivations of the myth. In Virgil's Aeneid, the classic Greek epic, Dido, the queen of Carthage, bought as much land as a bull's hide could cover. She covered more ground by cutting the bull's hide up into strips and placing it around the circumference of the land. And there are several similar myths that originate from the British Isles. In 1695, a diarist recounts the formation of Lincolnshire, that a man requested as much ground there as he could gain with an ox hide, and the king granted his request thinking, what a fool, and he was able to cut this ox hide into many, many long pieces, and by that means encompass a round, large compass of land. Ox hides were in fact used as markers in surveying and marking off property lines in colonial America. This is documented. The practice was not just in America, it was also used in medieval Scandinavia and in English colonies. And there is, in fact, also a documented colonial case in which boundaries were established not just by ox hides, but by gaining as much land as one could walk or ride round in one day. William Penn's son, Thomas, in the walking purchase of 1737, sent out long-distance runners to mark the land boundaries that the Delaware Indians believed were already measured by a man's walk, deceiving them into giving up an enormous tract of land. Noel Gish, in his book, presents another theory. He advances the idea that Smith may have put forward a concordant, also known as a papal bull, in the 17th century in order to settle the land dispute between himself and competing parties, including both Huntington and Brookhaven. And in his words, Smith knew that papal bulls could settle boundary disputes and establish property or possession rights. So he's thinking perhaps a literal interpretation that it may have derived from that. Still, another theory of how he got the bull nickname to begin with, his coat of arms, which depicts a bull above a shield. But then there's also the man's own nature. In the Southampton town father's words, unreverend carriage, his bullish nature. The man certainly had no shortage of chutzpah. And beyond his efforts to gain the land that would bear his name, he shows up repeatedly in many controversial court actions in Southampton town records. In 1650, he won a large sum of £15, 6 shillings from a fellow townsman, Thomas Doxey, and the very next year it was his turn to be a defendant in another case in which he was accused of slander against Mark Meggs, another local Southampton figure. And then, of course, we know about the long, drawn-out litigious action that he engaged in the last 3 decades to secure his land. In any case, it was a story that basically had taken on a life of its own by the late 1800s. And it still was actually not something that was taken as the gospel truth, even by his ancestors. I mean, Judge John Lawrence Smith, as I mentioned to you already, believed that it came somewhat out of that myth from the Aeneid, and also was skeptical of it, his own ancestor. But there were other people that were willing to say it's a charming story, but not the truth. This mural, by the way, was painted by Robert Gaston Herbert. He was an important WPA artist. He painted a number of scenes that are in different post offices across Long Island. And the original is out at Yaphank at a county building, an office building. It measures 9 feet by 9 feet. And here's a closer view of it. Really quite a fine, extraordinary painting, done in 1939. It was clearly the erection of the bull, though, that would probably fix this in our minds more than anything else. And that came about as a relationship, out of a relationship between the sculptor Charles Carey Rumsey and Lawrence Smith Butler. Lawrence Smith Butler had been among that group of family members in 1898 who dug up the bones, they believed, of Richard Smith, and also had a ceremony in which they placed a marker on the grave of Richard Smith. He goes off to school in Paris and is studying architecture, and he meets this young artist, Charles Carey Rumsey, who is also beginning his own career as a sculptor. Rumsey would eventually become an equestrian sculptor, would mostly do horse sculptures for wealthy New York society types. So a bull was not stretching things too out of his skill set. And Butler told him this story, and Rumsey set to work. And the results are seen in the maquette that was eventually produced by 1909 or so, based upon some marking that's actually on the base of this pedestal. Now, we've recently had this conserved. We had it cleaned by Joseph Chiarello, very important artifact to our collection, and extremely important to the town of Smithtown because of the fact that this is the artist's model that eventually was done before the casting of the actual bull that was completed after Rumsey had died in a tragic automobile accident in 1922, and eventually went to the Brooklyn Museum of Art before it finally came out in 1941, transported out here, the 5-ton bull, to sit where it finally sits. But there are other ways that the bull kind of fixed itself in our mind eventually. It was reprinted and used in all kinds of local material. The Riverside Inn's menu, and just shortly after the bull was erected in 1940s. This is from the late 40s, from the library's collection. Of course, we have this wonderful map that's done by Lawrence Grant White in the 1930s, and you have the great cartouche in the corner showing Richard and Sarah and the bull, and on the other side, I'm not even sure who the figure is on the other side. Do you know, Louise, the William Shakespeare-looking gent that's on the left-hand side in the corner? In any case, again, this map is also in the exhibit, so take a close look at it if you can. It shows basically the state of Smithtown in the late 1930s, and then it was eventually colorized a little bit more in the 40s.
Where is that model of the bull now?
The model's actually over at Caleb Smith House. It's on display.
Oh, it's there?
Yeah, it's on view, and I hope that you all can come see it. This is another poem. We've kind of introduced the lecture with a poem. This is by Paul Bailey, who was the publisher of Long Island Forum, and did this poem for an issue of Long Island Forum in 1956 with its illustration to accompany it. And it continued to basically filter out there through commemorations, through different public celebrations. You had Charlie Butler in the 1930s dressing up as the bull rider. There he is in the far background. We actually have the outfit that he wore that day. In fact, looks nothing like what a real member of Richard Smith's generation would have worn, but they didn't wear purple velvet, but it's nonetheless an interesting way of commemorating. And the 300th anniversary in 1965, which we document in great depth in the exhibition, which was a summer-long festival, but reached its high point in July of '65, in which they had bulls marching, they had people, even children dressed up as Richard Smith, and so on and so forth. Well, what do we know and what do we not know? And that's what I kind of want to end up with. I think where we need to go with this and where we need to try to find out more is to go back to Richard Smith's origins, back to Yorkshire, and contact researchers over on the other side of the pond, so to speak, because while we have long taken what a lot of historians have put together as work as being gospel truth, unless we're able to really go back to some of those original records, it's going to be hard to say for absolutely sure that the Richard Smith that came over at the age of 22 in 1635 is indeed our Richard Smith. Other stories abound about Richard Smith being a member of Cromwell's army. Well, that doesn't make sense because this was 1635 that he came over, and as we know, the English Civil War was in the 1640s. So there's more work that needs to be done on that, and then I'm also hoping as we transcribe letters and other documents that are in the Smithtown Historical Society collection that we'll find even earlier mention of the bull story, of the bull myth, to see where that started, because that beginning is somewhat fuzzy as well. But nonetheless, I've hoped that what I've given you tonight has at least given you sort of what we know now. And I continue to be interested in this, and we'll continue to learn more about it as we go on.